Hi everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Interestingly, we had a very beautiful conversation about decoloniality of colonial African context. And Professor Moses Ochonu from Vanderbilt University spoke extensively on the decoloniality of aristocracy, you know, um, in Nigeria during colonial period and especially in the northern part of Nigeria. So, what this thing extends to do is to widen our horizon on colonial concept and thinking through the idea of decolonization in African context. Thank you and stay tuned.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dimar, for that excellent introduction. I recognize a lot of faces here. It's good to be back at Penn. I was just here last year for something else. So, Sheikh, my friend, it's good to see you. And most importantly, it's good to see something that is put together by graduate students. When I was Dick Casanelli, all people who have Aldra, she's not here, but Aldra has been wonderful arranging the logistics of my travels and my visit. Um, Kelly, who picked me up from the hotel this morning, and we were having a wonderful conversation. And the conversation got interrupted, so we have to continue. Anyway, it's good to be here. And when I was a graduate student, I used to look forward to this type of event, with my peers, because I think there's something just generative, uniquely generative, I would say, about sharing your work with your peers. But I also used to look forward to the visits of senior scholars. Those days, I would always, it's almost like you could say that, you saw them as rock stars, and, their visits always energized you, and you said, oh, this is the kind of person that I want to be like. Um, So this is, for me, a great opportunity to interface with the new generation of Africanist scholars, to hear what they are doing, the exciting work that they are doing, but also to share my work and engage in a productive conversation. So this presentation, and by the way, I thought that that the keynote would come at the end, because I was so much looking forward to the papers. But it's all good. It's all good that I get to go first. Maybe I'll get to engage with you guys in a more relaxed mood, so I don't have to worry about my own presentation. This. So my recently published book, which is here, Emias in London, was published in 2022. And my ongoing project on the experiences of deposed African monarchs in colonial exile center the repertoires and experiences of aristocrats in African colonial history. Both of these projects have one thing in common: a concern with the place of African aristocrats and aristocracy in African colonial history. Both projects write aristocrats and their colonial experiences back into African colonial historiography, which has largely dismissed their voices as perspectives compromised by collaboration with the colonial oppressor. In this talk, I will use excerpts from these two projects to suggest the need to pose and answer what I frame as the aristocracy question in African colonial history. I do not mean to trivialize the intellectual enterprise that I'm about to outline here, but I want to begin with a personal story involving television and popular culture in Nigeria. When I was coming of age in Nigeria in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, there was a tradition of importing and showing Mexican soap operas on Nigerian National Public Television, NTA, for those of you who are Nigerian. One of those Mexican soap operas, those telenovelas, was titled The Rich Also Cry. Okay? Perhaps some of you are, I don't want to assume your ages. Matthias and Lizzie, I don't know if you remember. But back in those days, this was quite popular. It was shown every night on Nigerian National Television. So this was shown with subtitles, obviously because the original was in Spanish, right? This was shown with subtitles at prime time on Nigerian National Television and quickly became a nightly national obsession. Many Nigerians, including children, followed the daily evening showings of the series and knew the characters by name. One of the reasons The Rich Also Cry was so popular in Nigeria and translated across Nigeria's cultural, religious, and linguistic lines is that there is something fascinating and perhaps universal about aristocratic suffering and pain. Aristocratic pain is comforting to non-aristocrats like myself and yourself. But if there are any aristocrats in the room, anybody with aristocratic pedigree in the room, I apologize. But you get what I'm saying. It's comforting to us. The possibility for aristocratic suffering philosophically mitigates the anxieties of less privileged citizens and subjects. We take solace in their misfortune and suffering sometimes. In Africa, the rich also cry, metaphorically at least, right? So I want to propose that we as African scholars take the experiences, anxieties, and expressions of African aristocratic actors seriously as a legitimate subject of scholarly inquiry and contemplation. I also want to argue that the colonial predicaments of privileged African classes can sometimes help us to excavate the depth of colonial violence and post-colonial convulsion. As a historian, my window into this terrain of African colonial aristocratic experience is obviously historical. My empirical points of reference and departure are historical. Privileged African groups were not insulated from the trauma of colonization. My argument, which I declare upfront, is that paying attention to aristocratic colonial and post-colonial predicaments can open up previously neglected African texts and ways of seeing and feeling. In turn, these expressive and experiential forms can tell us more about colonization, its brutality, its legacies, and its post-colonial residues. So I do want to make my point here by referencing these two projects that I talked about, my recently published book, and the ongoing one. So I will begin with ABS in London, this one over here. And then I will work my way to my ongoing book project, which has the working title. Oh, by the way, I forgot to talk about this one. No popular Hollywood or sort of transnational television or filming phenomenon is complete if there's no Nollywood version of it. Nollywood that hasn't reproduced it, it doesn't exist, or it's not popular. So of course you have a Nollywood version of The Rich Also Cry, right? Just like you have the Nollywood version of most popular. The only one they haven't made a Nollywood version of yet is the Wakanda one. Maybe it's coming. Don't roll it out. It's coming. Okay. So anyway, just wanted to put this in. But this is the project that I'm working on at the moment. This is my new project. It is the working title is The Exilic Lives of Defiant Kings. And it's, as you can see, this is something that I put together. It's a story map and it's functional, but I just took a picture and posted it here. It's something that I'm still working on fine-tuning, which ultimately will become an interactive sort of map that I'll put online at some point. So if you click on these 4 kings that I'm working with, you can see their story brief. Also, this is the story of King Wanga, the king of Uganda. So it has a basic biographical information about him, but also it has this map showing his route from his domain to exile, where he ended up in the Seychelles, all the different routes through Somalia and so on and so forth. So it's going to be very interactive. We're still working on it. So this is something to give you just to give you a sense of what I'm working with. So it has the working title of Exilic Lives of Defiant Kings, but back to Emirs in London. Emirs in London analyzes the sightseeing travels of the emirs and aristocrats of northern Nigeria to Britain between 1920 and 1960. The book examines the travel narratives the emirs produced to document their metropolitan experiences and the ways the emirs used their travel to remake themselves as modern Muslim aristocrats. I theorize this African aristocratic exploration of the colonial metropole as reverse colonial ethnography. So I don't want to go into, let me just show some of the, just show some of the pictures that are in the book. All of these pictures are in the book, just to give you a sense of the kinds of sources, visual sources, but also textual sources that I work with in the book. So this is a picture of Diko. This is one of the characters. This is one of the emirs that I talk about in the book. And here is entourage in London, 1933. He has his sons, his grandson, his scribe, his aide, and so on. So typically, they will travel to London, to the UK with a large entourage of family members, but also aides. This is Edgar Diko and his grandsons at London Side Park. So their travels were well covered by the British press, were well documented, and these photos are in all sorts of collections across the world. This is Emir Diko again at a company, at a biscuit factory. His sons, his grandsons, sorry. They visited all kinds of places, as this is Diko visiting the Lord Mayor of London in 1921. The mayor here generously allowed him to sit on his mayoral throne, as it were.
Yes.
Just to get a taste of. Anyway. This is the Sultan of Sokoto. So on this particular visit, it wasn't just the Emir of Katsina, Diko, Muhammad Diko. He traveled to Britain with the Sultan of Sokoto, the most prominent Islamic ruler in Nigeria, but also the Emir of Gwandu, who was number 2, or is number 2 in the hierarchy of emirs of northern Nigeria. So all 3 emirs traveled to at the same time. So they are here, they are inspecting this plane in a Royal Air Force airfield somewhere in here. And this is the Sultan of Sokoto and the Emir of Gwandu, Emir of Kano with Frederick Lugard. A lot of people here know about Frederick Lugard. He needs no introduction. This is Lugard in the middle. And at this time, he was retired, living in some village outside of London. And they are visiting, every time they visited Britain, somehow they had to go and see Lugard, and he accompanied them to the zoo and they took this picture. Yeah. This is it's just a sample of some of the press coverage of the visit of the Emir of Katsina, Diko, Muhammad Diko. These are press clippings published in different British newspapers. Coverage of his visit. This is probably my favorite of the pictures. Here they are, Diko and his grandsons and his son and his aide, his scribe, admiring the traffic lights. This is Diko's wives, his 2 wives, are also being taken on a tour of London by the wife of one of the colonial officials who were guiding the Deco and his group. So the wife also was a volunteer as a tour guide, as it were, to guide the wives around. This is Deco's son and grandsons at the BBC. They visited the BBC, so they allowed them to play with equipment and all of that. This is Deco's grandsons at the London Zoo playing with their penguin. This is Deco and his entourage observing the bird. Okay. Deco and his entourage again at the North Wheel airstrip. On this occasion, they actually went on one of the aircraft. They actually, we had to take him on a short ride on one of these, went on a short flight. This is one of these royal actors. And he has a lot to say in his diary about his experience flying with them. So it's all in the book. And this is his son, who later succeeded him as Emir of Katsina. Usman Dago playing polo at the Cadminton Polo Club outside of Oxford in 1999. So whenever they would go to this visit, some of them who knew how to play polo would play polo as well. This was one of the things they enjoyed doing in Britain. And this is a fun photo. I just put it there because the pram was one of the items that they would always buy. They just love, it's in the book. I have an explanation for why they love to. They always, when we go shopping in Britain, almost every single one of them would buy this pram. But there's a whole explanation, there's a whole analysis of why they were drawn to the pram in the book. All right? Okay. So this reverse African ethnographic observation of Britain illustrates the sophisticated and nuanced ways the Muslim aristocrats of Nigeria navigated colonialism and engaged with colonial institutions, ideas, commodities, and aesthetics. This story runs counter to the simplistic portrayal of Nigerian aristocratic colonial subjects as handmaidens of colonialism, whose colonial experience was defined by collaboration, betrayal, and Anglophilic obsessions. To be sure, the aristocratic travelers expressed effusive admiration and even adulation for British metropolitan institutions and spaces. But both subtle and direct critique of metropolitan ways of life and cultures will never far from the surface. The emirs criticized several aspects of life that they observed in Britain. The aristocratic travelers found some British metropolitan sites to be underwhelming, especially when juxtaposed against their Nigerian analogs, or when framed in self-referential comparative terms. This is all to say that the aristocrats of northern Nigeria who explored Britain in this period developed a sophisticated template for managing colonial metropolitan hospitality, while also expressing their discomfort with aspects of British colonial modernity. Their perspective on Britain and metropolitan modernity was not one of uncritical adulation and unquestioning acceptance as alleged in mainstream African colonial historiography. Emirs in London makes several arguments, which I wouldn't want to rehash all of them here, because partly if I do that, then you won't buy the book to read it. So, but I want you to buy the book. So, but permit me to discuss one of them, one of those arguments, which I think is central to my current task of rehabilitating aristocratic agency and experience in African colonial history. In Emirs in London, I conceptualized the traveling aristocrats as subalterns. This framing, I think, needs to be unpacked. Both the Subaltern Studies Collective of Indian historians and the dominant schools of African colonial historiography insist on understanding African aristocrats and traditional rulers as elites. They understand these privileged participants in colonial business as binary opposites of subalterns, so understood narrowly as non-elites, mainly peasants. But emirs were not elites in the conventional epistemic sense, I would argue. They were custodians of both custom and religious tradition. They were organic political figures in ways that non-aristocratic Western-educated Africans were not. They were, in addition, socio-political role models for their Muslim subjects. This distinction is important because African colonial historiographical frames advance the concept of elite as an undifferentiated catch-all category for all African colonial subjects who were not peasants or workers. In the historiography of Anglophone colonial Africa in particular, aristocrats are conceptualized as conservative and Anglophilic Africans who were hegemonized and who in turn uncritically accepted the idioms of British modernity. But however enamored of colonial modernity they might have been, the emirs and aristocrats of northern Nigeria were fiercely committed to the preservation of the traditional and religious spheres that they presided over and from which they derived their legitimacy. Theirs was not an uncritical assimilation into British modernity or an aspiration to replicate all of its markers in their domains. Rather, they deftly sought ways to enlist tradition to temper modernity and to use the instruments of metropolitan modernity to reform tradition. Furthermore, the sharp dichotomy in attitudes towards colonial modernity and in post-colonial aspirations that Paratatarji posits in his book, The Nation and Its Fragments, between Indian elites and non-elites did not exist in Nigeria. For the aristocrats of Nigeria, much like was the case for non-aristocratic Nigerians as well, the embrace of modernity was necessarily selective and strategic. Emirs used the ingredients of metropolitan modernity to enrich some of their traditions, but they also hoped that existing traditions, both Islamic and pre-Islamic, would modulate modernity. This was a strategically nuanced engagement with colonialism that neither indicates assimilation into nor an uncritical commitment to modernity as an aspirational endpoint. When the emirs wrote about the metropole and its modernity in their travel notes, in their diaries, and in their travel memoirs, they did so to self-consciously show how sharply metropolitan life, technologies, and forms of social organization diverged from their counterparts in northern Nigeria. They routinely exaggerated this difference and this divergence, which they claimed was a foundational West African Muslim authority. For them, this difference was ultimately irreconcilable. Northern Nigerian Muslims were not culturally British and could never be. For the emirs, the aspirational paradigm for Northern Nigeria was not a nation immersed in the modernity of Europe. They wanted to use the cultural resources of the metropole to modernize their emirates without transforming these emirates into miniature replicas of Britain and without erasing their African Muslim singularities. This was a deliberately delicate engagement with European modernity on the part of the emirs and aristocrats of northern Nigeria. They were skeptical and even critical of several aspects of metropolitan modernity, while also importing tangible and intangible instruments of this modernity into their domains. This discussion, I think, involves the nexus of hegemony and elite subjectivity. The Muslim aristocrats of Nigeria neither fully exemplified the Gramscian formulation of hegemony nor the subaltern school's conceptualization of the category of the subaltern. In the original formulation of hegemony offered by Antonio Gramsci, consent and acquiescence are key enablers of hegemony. Clearly, the emirs and aristocrats of northern Nigeria never consciously or subconsciously naturalized or fully accepted the terms of modernity established by British colonizers. The aristocrats' appropriation and instrumentalization of metropolitan practices of modernity was done, I would argue, on their own terms. In that sense, they emblematized the subaltern studies' anti-Gramscian axiom of dominance without hegemony. And their metropolitan engagements diverged from the Gramscian theorization of hegemony. At the same time, the aristocrats' complicated repertoires, their organic connections to rural Muslim peasants, their routine experience of racism during their metropolitan travels and in Nigerian colonial society, and their acerbic critique of certain practices of modernity, all challenge the subaltern studies' insistence that elite colonial subjects cannot be subalterns, and that this analytical category should only apply to non-elites. The Muslim aristocrats of northern Nigeria were subalterns, I insist, but their subalternity was peculiar and needs to be unpacked and understood differently. They were literally subordinated to the power structures and institutions of colonization, and they knew their place in the colonial racial hierarchy. But they also skillfully negotiated the terms of this subordination, this subalternity, if you will, because they had some leverage as partners and mediators in colonial business. At the turn of the 20th century, the Muslim aristocrats reluctantly submitted to British colonial sovereignty, but they did not consent to or accept the terms set by colonizers. They sought at every juncture, and with mixed results, I should say, to subvert or alter those terms. They merely saw their submission as a temporary pragmatic act in the face of overwhelming British military superiority, while they waited for what they regarded as the day of liberation from the yoke of Christian European oppressors. In the meantime, they would cooperate with and participate profitably in colonial schemes. After all, the authoritative scholars of the Sokoto Caliphate had proclaimed during the days of conquest that such colonial engagements were permissible under Islamic law. And here I'm referencing the foundational work and pronouncement of Imam Buhari, who was the Vizier of the Sokoto Caliphate, who during the British conquest of Sokoto, after the Sultan had fled, there was confusion as to how to respond among the Muslim Ummah as to how to respond to the British. Should we flee with the Sultan? Should we flee to Sudan? You know the story? Or should we stay? Or should we fight? Or should we continue fighting? Even though it's futile now, what do we do? And this Fazil, who practically, for all practical purposes, became the leader at this point, said, he was also the custodian of the Islamic tradition of the court in Sokoto. So he says, well, so he issued a fatwa, basically saying, it's okay to accept the British and work with them and go along with what they say because we need to preserve the Ummah, we need to survive. But so outwardly cooperate with them, but inwardly oppose them in your mind. Oppose them in your mind, fight them in your mind, pray against them in your mind, but outwardly go along with them. So he issued the fatwa, which became the central, most important organizing principle that shaped the response of this elite, this aristocracy to the British subsequently. The emirs would extract benefits and privileges from colonialism without bending to colonial assimilatory goals or surrendering their Muslim and traditional African cultural identifications to colonial modernity. They became, in their own words, modern Muslim aristocrats. I think this is an insistence on their part on a hybrid identity and a complex cultural aspiration. African colonial historiography is plagued by a refusal to consider the insights that can be derived from aristocratic colonial experience. Aristocrats are variously theorized as Africans who, because of their imbrication of self-interested involvement in colonization, were compromised collaborators. We privilege the colonial experiences of regular Africans as authentic, and we analyze these experiences in binary opposition to those of aristocratic subalterns. The privileging of non-elite experiences of and perspectives on colonialism is as much an ideological move as it is a historiographical one. It was an early form of epistemological decolonization or decoloniality, if you will. This reluctance to consider African aristocratic lives and their epistemological possibilities as windows onto particular engagement with colonization has intensified as theories of coloniality and decoloniality have gained currency in African studies. These theories have had the unintended consequence of delegitimizing and erasing the self-referential narratives of African aristocrats who are perceived to have insufficiently opposed or to have embraced European modernity. I argue that it is time to take the voices and texts of aristocratic elites more seriously as part of our ongoing decolonial revision of African colonial history. The hard decolonial binary of elite versus non-elite colonial experience is itself, ironically, a legacy of the colonial bifurcation that must be rejected as a template for doing African colonial history. Rejecting this colonial bifurcation is, I insist, a decolonial intervention. Aristocratic biographies and itineraries have much to teach us about the workings of colonialism and the strictures and complex transactions of colonization. Here I distinguish colonialism from colonization. Colonialism being the ideology, the set of ideas underpinning the practice, colonization being the practice on the ground. Aristocratic colonial experiences can illuminate and clarify the scope and depth of colonial racism in showing that privileged aristocrats who were in the good graces of the colonizers and who had critical stakes in the colonial enterprise, despite their status, were subjected to racist humiliation in showing that I think will enable the quotidian pervasiveness of colonial racism to emerge in sharper relief. Aristocratic memoirs, texts, and other forms of life writings can give us new vistas for understanding colonial society, colonial power relations, and African engagement with colonial institutions, commodities, and aesthetics. As African colonial insiders in the indirect rule system of British colonial administration, aristocrats were witnesses to the bureaucratic processes that defined colonization and determined the fate of millions of Africans. Aristocratic Africans were, in addition, masters of imperial protocols. They knew how to work the imperial system to their and their subjects' advantages. Aristocrats cultivated the favors and privileges of colonial power formations by developing a vast repertoire of gestures, actions, rhetoric, and symbolic enactments. These engagements endeared them to colonial interlocutors and helped them to forge enduring affective ties across the colonial racial divide. In Emirs in London, I conceptualized this colonial protocol under the rubric of colonial kingship. This was a mutually beneficial colonial brotherhood. And yes, it was a brotherhood. there were no sisters in it. But this was a mutually beneficial colonial brotherhood that, as I showed in the book, was maintained through metropolitan rituals of hospitality, leisure, consumption, and nostalgia. This affective colonial cultural economy understandably unsettles the established historiographical taxonomies of our feelings. We have not yet developed the language or idiom to describe or take transracial colonial affective connections seriously as aspects of African colonial history. The concept of imperial loyalism, which is not my concept, but which is it's a concept that is out there, that was coined and to kind of try to capture some of these nuances. But this concept of imperial loyalism refers to the narrow set of enduring African expressions and does not, in my opinion, capture the nuanced engagements that constituted and lubricated colonial kinship, as I call it. W.E.B. Du Bois's idea, W.E.B. Du Bois calls it double consciousness, if you like. Franz Fanon would later conceptualize this phenomenon into a searing critique of Africa's colonial and post-colonial national bourgeoisies. But in my opinion, both scholars oversimplify the complexities of the elite subaltern behavior that they critique. The African colonial historiographical response to aristocratic colonial experiences and the sources that attest to these experiences has been characterized by dismissal and devaluation. We must treat these experiences because aristocrats wrote prolifically about their experiences under colonialism. We must treat these experiences not merely as alternate or contrapuntal experiences to so-called authentic African colonial experiences, but also as insightful African colonial libraries that complement the archives produced by and centered on ordinary African lives. Emias in London analyzes the mobility and experiences of favored African aristocrats, right? So far you're with me? These were favored, these were guys who were in the good graces of the British, right? Who were liked by the British. So then, for me, the logical question to pose is that of how to account for the divergence between the experiences of colonially privileged aristocrats, such as the emirs of northern Nigeria, and the experiences of aristocrats who not only failed to win colonial approval, but were perceived as a threat to the colonial order, and as a result were banished from their domains, were sent on exile. And that is what my current book project pivots to and deals with. So my current book project analyzes the colonial exile experiences of 4 African kings, as shown in the picture that I showed, whom the British expelled to far-flung islands during the violent years of colonial conquest. It is a transnational study of the intersection of aristocratic exile and colonial conquest. It focuses on the colonial exilic experiences of King Prempeh I of Ashanti. Kingsley, that's your man. King Prempeh I, King Mwanga II of Buganda, in modern-day Uganda, King Kabalega of Bunyoro, also in modern-day Uganda, and King Jaja of Opobo in modern-day Nigeria. So those 4 kings. So all 4 kings were banished by British colonizers at the turn of the 20th century. The first 3 kings spent their exile on the Indian Ocean island of the Seychelles, while Jaja spent his exile on the eastern Caribbean islands of St. Vincent and Barbados. In the case of King Prempeh I, his original exile party of 52 family members and 8 was joined in 1901 by the captured leader and hero of the Ashanti's last uprising against the British, Queen Mother Ya Ashantiwa, and 15 of her fellow captives and rebels. I want to understand how Ya Asantewa experienced exile, both as an aristocratic woman and as a former anti-colonial resistance leader, who was understood as a threat in both generic and gendered ways. I used the experiences of Asantewa, who was both an aristocrat and an anti-colonial resistance fighter, to challenge the problematic historiographical dichotomy between so-called aristocratic collaborators and non-elite subaltern resistors. What might a history of aristocratic colonial exilic trauma look like? How was the loss of status and prestige and the attendant humiliation experienced and expressed during and after exile. How did the exiled aristocrats understand their status as colonial political prisoners? In advancing answers to these and similar questions, this book project hypothesizes the moment of conquest not simply as a period of violent usurpation of sovereignty and mass trauma. I also posit the period as a time defined by a profound rupture in African aristocratic institutions embodied by kings who defied and resisted British conquest, and in doing so were forced to make way for aristocratic alternates of questionable legitimacy. With the help of letters and petitions written by the kings from exile, colonial correspondence, related archival sources, interviews, royal law, vernacular texts, and commemorative artifacts, I analyzed the experience of exile from the perspectives of the kings themselves and of the aides and family members who accompanied them into exile. My analysis intervenes in one of the major enduring debates of African colonial studies over the contested categories of resistor and collaborator. The kings resisted British colonial efforts to usurp the sovereignties of their kingdoms, but the circumstances leading to their arrest and exile revealed changing colonial encounters and dealings that were more complex than those suggested by the familiar binary of resistance and collaboration. Moreover, once the kings settled, however uncomfortably, into life in exile, they often vacillated strategically between defiant protests and crafty strategic appeals to imperial legal principles and moral claims. This shifting maneuver reveals coextensive strategies that are usually separately associated with so-called African resistors and collaborators. The king's shifting strategies, I argue, dissolve the binary of resistance and collaboration. The ways in which these kings related to colonial institutions before, during, and after exile illuminates the contingent meanings and fluidity of the categories of collaboration and exile, collaboration and resistance. Sorry. The monarchs did not docilely accept their exile. They protested vehemently, both against their imprisonment in foreign spaces and their treatment in confinement. They also engaged in a robust epistolary enterprise, writing copious petitions to British authorities to make their case for freedom and better treatment in captivity. They wrote letters to their families back home to intervene in family matters and royal affairs. So I'm going to show some of these letters and petitions to see if I can. So this is King Prempeh first. He says he wants the British to increase his allowance. I'm a king. I may be deposed, but I've cultivated a certain lifestyle that I need to maintain. So give me enough money so that even in exile, in the Seychelles, I can maintain, my large family. I can maintain a certain level of standard of living, befitting of a king or of a former king, right? I can't live on my current allowance. This is a funny one. This is funny one. So King Prempeh ends up in the Seychelles. Obviously, he goes there with his two wives, but he converts to Anglicanism, so he's baptized. There's a whole story about why he did that and how he did that. Once he is baptized, he petitions the British government to allow him to divorce his previous two wives, because now he says, "Well, I'm an Anglican, and I can only have one wife, and I'm starting afresh." so in his mind, he thinks, now I'm a new Christian. I'm a Christian now, I've just converted, so I should be allowed to marry my one true wife. But that's because he saw a lady there in the Seychelles that he liked, that he was drawn to, and he wanted to be allowed to legally divorce his two wives and to marry that one lady. He said, "Well, this is my new true wife now, under this new religion that I'm converting." But so there's a whole exchange about that. And of course, one official allowed him and said, yes, I don't see anything wrong with this. But then he was overridden. Another British official was they overrode him and said, no, we can't allow this. This is ridiculous. This is Prempeh writing to the British authorities from exile, requesting that an Ashanti instructor, an account instructor be sent to him. It says, I'm learning to read in English, to read and write in English, but I also need to learn to read and write in my own language, this account. So I need someone sent from the Gold Coast directly to the Seychelles to teach me. It's all good that I'm learning to read and write in English. I appreciate that. You've given me this instructor, but I need another instructor who knows the account language, who can teach me how to read and write in it. This is a petition without program. So he says, we are bored in this place. They have nothing to do. It's so boring here. So give us a soccer pitch, a football pitch, and a cricket field. Those are the two things he wants. At least give us something to do to occupy our minds and to have some recreation on this island that we can't speak the language, we don't know the surrounding communities. We're all here, So give us some recreation to keep us busy. And he wants his nephews to be brought over from the Gold Coast. I miss my nephews so much. I hear that they are growing up. Because he's getting letters, right? He's getting letters from the Gold Coast, and they're telling him about how his nephews are doing. He was so fond of them, and he says, look, I miss them every day. Can you bring them over here? So at least they can live here with me, right? So I can see them every day. So this is Queen Mother, his mother, the Queen Mother, yeah, Santiwa. This is a very sad one. This is a very depressing petition. And the reason it's depressing is that her daughter, the deposed king, Prempeh's sister, got into debt. Now, this is the ultimate humiliation and insult for a royal, right? She's the sister of the king, the deposed king. It doesn't matter. She gets into debt, and the debt collectors are on her doorstep. They're asking for her to pay back her debt. She's falling on hard times. She's almost destitute. And the news of her predicament reaches her mother, the Queen Mother. And she says, just lend me this money. In our culture, this is the ultimate humiliation, that a member of the royal family, the sister of the king, the daughter of the Queen Mother, owes money to people, to commoners, and now they want their money back. And I'm already humiliated, living on a foreign island, away from my people, and to hear news that my daughter is in this predicament would kill me. So give me advance £32 from my allowance. I'll pay back. We can deduct it, but I need to send this money to her to get her out of this situation. This is King Jaja, one of the kings that I look at. This is his petition, written in 1891. He's writing from Barbados, right now. He says, I don't know if you can read this. This one here says, I'm very sick. I'm not at all well. And he's truly sick because the British government sends doctors, a team of doctors to examine him, and he has all kinds of ailments. Later on, he's discovered to have some terminal ailments, diabetes, and so forth. And here he's saying, look, I want to die in the midst of my people. I'm very sick. I don't want to die in a foreign land, in exile. I want to die surrounded by my family, my sisters, my nephews, my nieces, my uncles. He continues, the petition continues, goes through this and he died any moment from now. And it is the ultimate insult of a king to die in a foreign land, across the waters, and to be buried, outside of his domain. So we continue to all of this. Okay, so this is, you get the gist of it. So this exiled kings, these banished kings, were writing copiously, writing these petitions and letters. The letters and petitions of the exiled kings constitute an archive of their suffering in exile. The writings also document their powerful interlocutory agency in the orbit of colonialism. They were subaltern insurgents who insisted, even in captivity and in exile, on being heard by both British colonizers and their own African kinsfolk. Although censored and mediated by colonial filters, the letters and petitions provide a snapshot of their lives in exile, their struggle for freedom and rights, and their efforts to maintain connections with their former subjects and subordinate chiefs at home. The king's letters and petitions served to humanize them against their portrayal in British reports as recalcitrant and authoritarian brutes whose forceful removal from their domains was necessary for peace and order to reign. Secondly, the letters restored some of the dignity the kings had lost during their humiliating captivity and their transportation as human trophies of conquest on colonial ships to distant islands. Letters have a certain intimate quality to them, as they contain clues to the inner conflicts and thoughts of the individuals who author them. The king's letters and petitions are emotion-laden documents. When read beyond their literal communicative dimension, they reveal emotions and semiotic possibilities that lead us to what the writers were feeling about their political activity at that time. The letters and petitions convey the anxieties, fears, aspirations, traumas, and hopes of the aristocrats. The letters are emotional artifacts and gateways to the inner exilic lives of the aristocrats, enabling us to reconstruct an intimate history of aristocratic colonial exile that has been largely neglected in African colonial historiographies. The overarching historiographical question at the heart of this book project is that of whether the African aristocratic colonial subject suffered under colonialism. And if so, what that suffering looks like, the nature of that suffering. Is there a space in African colonial historiography to account for aristocratic trauma? And if so, what kind of vocabulary can we deploy to capture and describe this trauma without denying the relative privilege of favored subaltern aristocrats? Aristocrats also suffered the indignities, violence, and racist humiliation inflicted by colonizers. Their suffering unfolded differently and can be researched and understood. But this aristocratic trauma cannot be posited as a counterpoint to mass African colonial suffering, but rather as a complement to it. Exile and banishment and the many disruptions that they produced are important windows, I argue, into aristocratic colonial trauma. The epistolary expressions and other self-representational texts authored by colonially exiled monarchs tell a rich story of African aristocratic colonial experience, which deserves a central place in African colonial historiography. I would like to end by returning to the theme of decoloniality, which is in the title of the talk. If decoloniality implies the total rejection of all epistemic, cultural, economic, and sociopolitical legacies of colonialism in response to the totalizing, insidious, and ubiquitous presence of colonial and neo-colonial power, then the aristocratic colonial experiences discussed in this talk fall outside the epistemic boundaries of the decolonial term. But if decoloniality is about creative African navigations of colonialism, about the preservation of the African self in the face of colonization, and about the role of African agency in determining the reach and staying power of colonial influences, then African subaltern aristocratic experiences fit, however counterintuitively, into the decolonial theoretical frame. In that case, catalytic African aristocratic colonial agency needs to be recognized as part of the broader theoretical abstractions of the decolonial epistemological term. My understanding of decoloniality leads me to believe that it would benefit from the recovery and excavation of African actions and texts, however constrained those texts and experiences may have been by colonial power and its predations. It seems to me that the task of decoloniality is enhanced by privileging the experiential archives produced by Africans of different sociopolitical and economic orientations and pedigrees in the orbit of colonialism. African aristocrats were close to the top of the colonial political food chain, right? Yet, as symbols and embodiments of African sovereignty and resilience, they were targeted by colonial power formations and when they failed to align with colonial priorities. This mixed colonial fortune, this simultaneous proximity to colonial power and exposure to its venal brutality gave aristocrats a peculiar location from which to understand and experience colonial domination. Their documented perspectives therefore constitute a revealing but misunderstood body of knowledge. This embodied African knowledge can, I argue, illuminate the coloniality of power produced in the crucible of oppression, while also displacing the epistemic legacy of colonial power relations. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. We open the door for comments and discussion. Question.
This is just a comment. I really enjoyed the presentation and especially the prepper parts that you showed because I never knew, and as you mentioned, it confirms like the humanity of these people. Like even in like the stories that you were told like throughout the history of Ghana, like I went through 12 years of basic education in Ghana, and I never saw like this aspect of it. So I really enjoyed like seeing the humanity and the fact that they were able to like correspond back and forth. You know, yes. I had a comment on the he requesting for his nephew. I just wanted to add that it's also because we in Akan culture we inherit matrilineal. So the next king is the nephew of the current king, who is elected by the queen mother before the person becomes king. So most people feel some closeness to their nephews than even to their own children. So that's why he was requesting for.
I really appreciate that comment, and I have to talk to you more about that later. Because this is I'm still working on the ideas, right? So this is the value of this type of forums. You get feedback like this, and this is something I was wrestling with. Wow, this because the way he talked about in his letters, he didn't talk about his children in those times. I was just wondering the fondness for those two nephews of his, him wanting them to be brought over. And he offered to pay the cost as well. In fact, the British, I think, will pay the cost of their. So I always wonder. So that's very insightful. Yeah.
So the likelihood that that nephew become king is higher. His children don't really matter.
It's amazing. That's a great. Yeah, you're giving me something to work with. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I'm so sorry I came in late. I'm so happy I came. So thank you so much for this incredible lecture that I always expect that from you, Moses. So it's really nice to see you. I have two questions. The first one will be about the petitions, and that is, where did you find them? What archive did you find these petitions in? And then how did the British answer? That's my first set of questions. The second question is, I've really, and if I missed it, I apologize, but you kind of went for W.B. Du Bois and Frantz Fanon in a very interesting way, and very diplomatically, but there was a lot of punch behind it. And I would like to hear more about what you say about their misreadings of the colonial, particular kind of colonial structure. You know, that was really fascinating.
Thanks, Eve. I always appreciate your questions and insights and engagements. Let me start with the second round. I think when I read Du Bois and Fanon, I'm great admirers of both theorists and scholars. And but I think that in writing about the idea of double consciousness, let's start with the voice. I think it has some utility. It does illuminate certain kinds of, I would say, colonial subjectivity, let's put it down. And there are examples of that across West Africa, mostly that I'm familiar with, people who are simultaneously situated in the colonial sphere and also in the traditional sphere, and they're trying to navigate it and they don't know quite where they belong, and their thoughts are in both situated in both places, and also their comportment, even in their sartorial carriage, all of these things, and they lack a sense of, they are drawn to colonial ideas. And Fanon does a good job of, I think Fanon is great in trying to just give a vivid imagery to that. The idea of the native, the colonized subaltern wanting to be, like the colonizer, wanting to be like the colonizer, and struggling with self-identity as a result, but at the same time, resenting the colonizer. So there's this curious mixture of resentment and admiration that Fanon talks about a lot. So I think that has utility, but what I'm trying to say is that for aristocratic characters, subalterns, like the emirs that I'm looking at here, and this case, it just doesn't quite, the itinerary tends to diverge from that characterization a little bit, simply because they were very self-assured in their, so to say, double consciousness. It wasn't a problem for them, if you can call it that. In that sense, to use the term double consciousness to characterize their complex itineraries and choices would be a bit reductive. This is what I'm trying to say here. Especially for these areas, because they never saw, from all the sources that I've read, they never saw a conflict between dabbling into aspects of British modernity and tapping into those aspects that they thought would benefit them, their domain, in which their traditions and so on, help them to develop their kingdoms. The Hausa word is Zamani, which is the sense comes from time and modernity. To bring them into modernity, they want to bring their domains into modernity. But they didn't see the conflict with that. They didn't see that as necessarily being differential to the British, because they also criticized the British, as I said in the book. There's copious examples of their piece. So they saw they had a much more complex engagement with colonialism than the term global consciousness would suggest. For Fanon, I think the critique of the national bourgeoisie and the post-nationalist colonial and post-colonial bourgeoisie, I think completely sidelines characters like this, completely leaves them out, leaves emirs out, and aristocrats out of the picture, and focuses more on the greater educated colonial elites, who, in fairness to Fanon, did exhibit a lot of the characteristics, a lot of the more subservient, some of them, not all of them, because they were radical ones as well, right? So we can sort of take the radical ones out of Fanon's characterization as well. But I think just that theorization does not speak to the experiences and the itineraries and the choices and the repertoires of these aristocratic identities. The first question about the sources in this petition, most of them, I got some of them from the British Library, from the British Archive, in Britain, shortly before the pandemic, I went there.
Was it foreign?
Yeah, no, not foreign office,
No, but I mean, are these the foreign office records?
Yes,
Okay.
they are actually, yes, they are Cubans. So a lot of the data petitions come from there. Some of the complete petitions and letters are from there, but some are from Pras in Ghana.
Yeah.
Some are from the Pras in Ghana, the archive.
No,
Okay. And some are from there, and some are from the Madhya Palace archive. The Madhya Palace archive. And then I think a few of those letters are from they come from the GOM, Institute of African Studies, the archive there. So they are from all over the place. The Prempeh petitions and letters are from all over the place. The Jaja ones are mainly from the Kew Garden. I've gotten a few from Barbados. Yeah, from the archive in Barbados. Once the pandemic was over and things opened back up, I was able to have somebody that I'm working with, who's a research assistant of mine, we're going back and forth, and she was able to find some of this. I guess
Okay. This is a great project, really a whole collection, which is a kind of a sequence of studies, right, of aristocratic subalterns. And it's a story, obviously, that goes beyond even the 4 cases you're working on now. And if you look at the king of Zulu, for example, Sechliah, right, who was exiled, and then the British had kind of tried to bring him back. And there's a lot of French cases. I don't know, Samori might be one, right? Samori, I mean, everybody's going into exile. And in a way, it's almost like a trope, and so one of my questions has to do with when these folks are writing their petitions and kind of sustaining their sense of dignity and it's like they're keeping the idea of sovereignty alive. Like they expect this kingship that they've removed me from is not dead. I'm still here, and we're gonna, it's going to come back. I'm going to see my nephews, and maybe we'll get this going back again. So I'm wondering, in a way, it's kind of what the reception of these people in exile were among their people. I know it's hard to get at that, but did people say, yeah, we know this king, he might not be here now with us, he's subordinate in this, but it's still there, and there's a kind of a continuity that these exiled folks are maintaining. And then I bring it up even to more recent times, like the last Mwami of Rwanda, who lived in Washington, D.C., after the revolution, the Hutu revolution. He went to D.C., was living in, I think, public housing or something like that, hoping that the kingship would come back in Rwanda, Kagame had no intention to do that. But I think these are sort of the whole Haile Selassie aristocracy in Ethiopia. These are people, these are stories that are like the whole history of colonial Africa is full of these kinds of stories, and you're able to really, aristocrats leave records, or they're willing, there's more source material. So it's a great thing. And I hope you have a bunch of students who are gonna chase down all of these kings in exile and aristocrats in exile. It's marvelous possibilities, I think, for looking at why there are continuities, and why maybe African ideas of sovereignty are still, the sort of indigenous ones or aristocratic ones haven't died out 60 years after independence. You know what I mean? There's still the David Davidson idea of, that the traditional leadership is something that's still out there, and part of people's consciousness. I don't know what the public response to people in exile. It reminds me of Africans who were in jail. It's a parallel to all those, the credibility of the credentials of Mandela and of Kenyatta and of Nkrumah by being jailed in the heart of the nationalist movement. This is a kind of a parallel story on the aristocratic side. So I just see so many different kinds of ways you could go with this. And I guess just comments more than questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot for suggesting all those different possibilities and trajectories, because as I'm wrestling with these projects, all of these are, and I like to feedback a lot about public perception and public engagement. About 15 years ago, in the wrong on the date, but there was a short documentary film made when the current king, this decision. Because it turns out that when the King Brigade was freed with his entourage to go back to Ghana, one of his sons stayed back, and a few other family members stayed back in the Seychelles. Yes, yeah. And of course our children. And so there's a whole Primitive clan, primitive diaspora, or I shall tell you diaspora. They're no longer royal because regular citizens in the Seychelles. And the Prime Minister of the Seychelles welcomed him, and it was a whole big thing. It was a state visit, and was given a lot of honor. Was taken to where his grandfather, right, lived in exile, the camp, they call it the Ashanti camp, in Mahi Island. We got to tour of the place. Went to meet the president, met with his relative, his cousins, right? Met with the patriarch or the matriarch of the family now. So she represented the family, And the family had grown, the Seychelles side of the family had grown, and many of them have become teachers, doctors, but you know, so it was a big event that connected Ghana with Seychelles, keeping alive this whole.
Yeah. Jaja had a monument or a statue built to him, right, after he came back, didn't he? I mean, yeah.
Absolutely.
The Pogo, yeah. So it's a kind of the public sort of remembering these people. Yeah, we're not gonna let you go, you know?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Jaja, even in those times, as he was going through his ordeal, because that was one of the comments you made, which I wanted to speak to actually, which is very fascinating, because at that time, as he was writing these letters and petitions to the British, asking for freedom, asking for medical treatment, asking for all these things, you know, I want to die in this. His own people were mobilizing and writing letters to the British consul in the Niger Delta as well, and asking for him to be released, and saying, echoing the same thing, saying it would be insulting to the ultimate humiliation if our king were to die in exile.
Yeah.
You know, if our king were to die in foreign land, please bring him back to us. He is sick, we know that he's terminally ill, but we want him to die here so that we can bury him with dignity. And also, Prempe, people were mobilizing in Ghana, especially the educated Akan intellectuals at that time. They were writing letters, they were publishing in the newspapers, have newspaper petitions, have newspaper report. You know, every now and then, like every once a month, you see this whole page sort of, and with multiple signatures of all the leading intellectual figures of the Ashanti Kingdom signing the petition. So they were writing. So they kept his memory alive, they kept the kingship alive, they kept the idea that he was the symbol of Ashanti sovereignty alive, and they made that clear in their letters, in their petition that they wrote to London. And in fact, they sent, on one occasion, they sent a delegation to London. Yeah, the Aboriginal Rights Protection Society. Also, more focused Ashanti groups, intellectuals, were mobilizing. They kept the issue alive.
That's an untold story. I mean, that's a big story. It's across the continent, I think.
Yeah.
Just amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's about those who travel to London, the aristocrats. Are they like specifically? Are there like those people who have been sent to or travel to London? Are they only related to the royal families, or they include other like this non-royal families? Because I'm just saying this in relation to what I forgot in the history of Sudan. Also, we have people, religious leaders, being sent or travel to London, and in one of those groups like this, these WhatsApp groups. At one point they put that picture of the emirs in front of the this travel traffic lights, and they said these are Sudanese. So I have to go and dig and find out, and we told them that no, these are not Sudanese. Because they knew in our history that like, at one point like they were being sent to congratulate the king for his coronation, and you know the figures who were there. So I'm just thinking about whether in your research you find also when you tell the aristocrats, who are the aristocrats?
Yeah.
Are they mainly people who are just associated with the traditional leaders, or were they also include other segments from the society?
Well, that's a great question. I think for the most part, they were people of royal descent because that was the point of it from a British perspective. Because the people who were, they had to go through multiple vetting processes, the British had to approve of them, all that stuff. You know, it's all in the book, and then, the British wanted to milk this. Let's not lose sight of that. They wanted to milk this visit, for propaganda purposes. They wanted to use them to showcase, and they wanted to take them to the metropole to dazzle them with the sights and sounds of British modernity, and leave them impressed and dazzled, and in the hope that they would come back to northern Nigeria and become more loyal to the British. They wanted to shock and awe them, right? So, but that was the purpose, and who better to do that with than the the emirs and the title holders and the aristocracy, who were already embedded in colonial administration as mediators and as officials and so on, district heads and so on and so forth. So for that purpose, for that reason, the emirs dominated this. However, having said that, there were a few people who I would say became aristocrats by association, who were included in these visits. I'll give a good example. One of the foremost organic intellectuals from Northern Nigeria, Abubakar Imam, was editor of the Gaskiya Tafukobo, this Hausa language newspaper. Was an organic intellectual, is considered one of the intellectual figures, one of the leading intellectual figures of all times in Nigeria. Wasn't a royal himself, wasn't descended from a royal family, but by virtue of his education, by virtue of also his embeddedness in the traditional setting, by virtue of him being perceived as someone who consistently defended the traditional and the Islamic institutions and ways of life. You know, somebody who wasn't a radical, like Aminu Kano, wasn't into leftist politics, who was not a critic of the Islamic establishment of the Sufi Brotherhood, for instance, or someone who was embedded in it, who was a defender of it. By virtue of all of those things, I would say that he was given an honorary membership of the aristocratic community. And because of that, he went to some of these visits. In 1939, he toured Britain, all of Britain, extensively. And out of those experiences, he wrote the book, Tafia Mabudin Ilimi, which translates to knowledge, travel is the gateway to knowledge. It's an iconic text, literally, and I use it extensively in the book as well. It's an Hausa language. So he comes back and writes this book. But he's an exception. But he's an exception because he's an extended member of the aristocracy by virtue of all of the factors that I outlined.
And that means also likewise those who sent to exile also, not all of them, like this.
Of course, yes, by association as well,
Okay.
right? Because they were associated with it. Yes, I think
Hi, my name is Myra. So I have a comment, or two comments. The second one's like a comment/question. So my first comment was really like you said earlier about the aristocrats also suffered their own violence and humiliation. But I think bring back dynamics and the nuance of the things. And I think that kind of conjures up certain things in terms of like we tend to think that folks within a diverse group may not experience any sort of harm in the process of things and how that kind of be like globally. So thank you for that. I think kind of confident nice word connection between Black people over how we tend to categorize ourselves within that category. And we think certain groups based on class or certain based on this are better off because we're all experiencing the system at the same time. So thank you for that. But my next thing was as someone who is very used to this topic of the exile kings and things like that. It's my first time actually hearing about their names, things like that. I was also curious because it seemed like you touched on it with the man from Rwanda who was in DC. No, who said that? That was you guys in DC in public housing, and you touched on it again about one campaign and Seychelles starting a family there. But I'm curious about because when you said the word exile at first, it kind of conjured up a different image than what the letters kind of presented in terms of like communication and some level of openness. Like I thought of like Bible times, you're like exiled and like you're just like nowhere to be seen, like you're not in contact with anybody. Yeah, that's what was first came in my head. So this is really great, kind of subversion of that image, right? But I'm kind of curious as like you're building this up and like continuing this project, like not to take away from the point of the writing, but I'm curious about more about how they engage with members of the diaspora. We talked about like King Jaja, being in the Barbados, like not to say that against the revolutionary, but I'm curious about what that looked like as some of this African and Caribbean setting, things like that. Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to be brief with my response. Great comments and great questions. King Jaja becomes a lightning rod of Caribbean, especially Eastern Caribbean anti-colonialism. He's instantly embraced as a figure as a Pan-African figure. He's from the continent, he's a king. He becomes, the British sends him, they send him there to keep him from making trouble. But ironically, he goes there and it becomes this lightning trouble for long, years. the intellectual elite in St. Vincent and in Barbados and in the neighboring islands instantly embrace him. He's constantly meeting with people in his home, in his exile, where they put him up. He's never without company. You know, they are writing a lot of newspaper articles about him, and they have collected so much already. So the British, again, become skittish. It's like, we brought this guy here to live out the rest of his life in obscurity and invisibility, and all of a sudden now he's making all this trouble for us. He's meeting with the president, he's visiting the parliament, because at this time there was the parliament was all black, right? Because Caribbean people, they had their own power. He's visiting them, he's giving speeches. People are inviting him to their homes, people are inviting him to churches, they're inviting him to all kinds of places to talk about his predicaments, his experience, you know. There's all these legends also that emerged in the Caribbean to try to curate his story, but to curate it in a way that we have hyperbolic, like, you know, sculpture, this was done to him. Again, but this was done for domestic purposes, for the nationalists, the anti-colonial nationalists, to use his story. They began to actively, self-consciously mine his story and his biographical details for their own ends in the Caribbean, right? So that becomes, so definitely becomes that. And in a way, that speaks to what you were saying. That speaks to this idea that colonial exile was never a straightforward thing. The British had a certain conception of it. But once these kings found themselves in some of these places, what they did and what is totally different. How they use their exile, how they become very active, they become very, you know, radical in certain ways, which went against their conservative, royal demeanor. In fact, when they were kings, they became activists. They embraced their role. Jaja, he loves it. He goes around, he gives speeches, he plugs himself into the networks of the activist, nationalist, anti-colonial networks in Barbados. That becomes a problem for him later on, because then when he starts writing those petitions asking for things, the British sees that as an opportunity to teach him a lesson, and, you know, and to try to bring him in and to try to restrict his mobility in those islands. Also. So I don't know if that this is something else that you said that I wanted to speak to that I can't quite. There's another aspect. Shared experience.
Yeah, I said a few things, but shared experiences and different pockets of Black culture, diaspora. I mentioned DC with Rwanda.
Yes, yes. You know, this story, like Lee said earlier on, it's a widespread story. The only reason I didn't include Ahmad Bamba and was sent to Gabon, right? Samuel Touré, I know it's because I don't know French. My French is terrible. I'm just going to be upfront with you. Otherwise, this project could be bigger. This story could be a lot bigger. And of course, you mentioned other people. And you know, so many others that I could have included as well.
That's why it's a team. We have to have a team.
Yeah. What the French perspective would have brought to the picture. First of all, this is a wonderful project. I'm dying to wait for the book to come out. This is wonderful. It's a content story, and not before getting to the French one. I don't know, when we think, why was this story there for everybody to see? You know, I've been to Cuba myself. You know, many people have been there. You've seen these questions, nobody thought about them. So my question I'm asking here is a epistemological kind of question. What did nationalism do to these stories? And really silencing them or erasing them completely. Because these are stories we don't want to tell in the 1960s and 70s. We don't want to tell them at all. Maybe now we can, because we have French heritage, we have a new way of nationalism that is really completely writing African colonial history and post-colonial history. Maybe this story will change. So the question, why were these stories there but nobody thought about them? And these are wonderful stories to tell. So the French one now is, what is interesting is that it's a very different experience with the French. I only know one case of the French taking the grandson of Ahmad al-Tijani and taking to France in the 19th century to showcase France. Nothing else anywhere else. So they did not encourage this to happen. But it happened with the French. And then the question is why? We are here in the case, of course, of a kingdom. First, with the queen and the king, that has certain reverberation on how the British crown see those kings. Then there is indictable too, where the British are ruling through these kings and these sultans in northern Nigeria, and also the traditional rulers in Ghana. Now, you suggested that well, the British had something to learn from this. It's showcasing modernity, and I think in the Deco book, your book on the Emir, you also seem to embrace this idea of them as being as being agent of modernity, bringing back modernity in northern Nigeria. But these are also seen as custodian of conservative Islam, most recent modern. How do you reconcile these seemingly contradictory stories? And the third question is, you seem to be describing all these kings and rulers as a community with shared experience. Now, when we drill down in these experiences, what do we see that might shape their experience differently? Some have been taken while resisting to colonial rule and exile. Some have been exiled because they have been seen as obstacle to smooth colonial rule. You know, some are heir to the rule, some are not. So they seem to have different experiences too. So how do you kind of tell a narrative that can do justice to these different experiences, temporarily as well as substantially?
Yeah, no, great question, Sheikh. So your second question is particularly fascinating. You said, yeah, you're right. I mean, the emirs, when I first approached that subject, I too thought, well, no, this idea of self-consciously understanding themselves, these emirs, as purveyors of modernity, especially medical modernity, and they seem proud of it. How do we reconcile that with the fact that they were custodians of this Islamic tradition, inheritors of a glorious jihadist, Islamic reformist tradition, with his caliphate and everything? Well, one thing that, we all encounter surprises in the field, when we're going to the field. And one of those surprises was that in Katsina, where Diko, for instance, came from, they surprised me because they embraced so much of his modernist project. They memorialize it to this day. They compose songs in praise of him, of his firstness. He was first to bring this. He was first to modernize, to establish a modern police force, modeled after the British constabulary, Royal Constabulary. He was first to bring the idea of the Beitul Mal, to modernize this treasury. He was first to bring polo field to Katsina, and he established a polo club, and he inducted his sons into play polo. He was the first to bring a school, a modern school, a secular school to Katsina. So there are all these folklore and folk narratives about how much of a pioneer he was in this business of bringing back modernity to modern Nigeria. That was, so my narrative had to be faithful to that. My analysis had to be faithful to that, because that fully was a surprise. But he wasn't the only surprise, because when we go across northern Nigeria, even in Kano, I have a section, the later part of the book, on Kano as well, where there was an actual room, room England, that was this England chamber, named after England, to commemorate this collection. But the point of all of this is to say that these people don't see the contradictions. For them, it's all about the practicalities and the pragmatics of empire. You take what you can get from the empire. You take certain aspects, you take certain symbols, you take certain institutions that are considered developmental. One of the emirs of Kano electrifies Kano. He builds a modern water project in Kano as a modernizing project, explicitly modeled after the water project of the town in England, because he goes there and sees it and says, well, I'm going to have this in Kano. I want this in Kano. So that's the way they are thinking about it. They are not thinking in terms of their ideological contradictions, which are actually there, absolutely. They are thinking more about, when they bring back modernity, more about what I might call bread and butter modernity, everyday modernity, right? So that's the way they were thinking about this issue. The second question, the last question, I want to speak before I know we're running out of time.
The French system or the
Yes,
yeah,
that's the epistemological aspect of this. You answered the question perfectly, I would say. In the 60s and the 70s, nationalist historiography predominated. And in that atmosphere, in that epistemological and historiographical context, stories like this could not break through, because stories, people like this were perceived as who participated in colonial business, who compromised, right?
Yeah.
Who were collaborators, right? Who have nothing to teach us about colonialism, about colonial resistance, because much of African colonial history at that time was suffused in the language of resistance, in the language of anti-colonialism, right? And these people didn't fit into that frame. Even those that were exiled, who suffered because they resisted, were still seen as too privileged, because, as my sister was saying here, even in exile, they were still allowed to write letters, they were still allowed to petition. So that didn't fit into the frame of colonial victimhood that came to be constructed as a guiding historiographical framework for what we do in colonial African history. Like you said, it's only in the 90s, I would say in the 90s, with the work of Mamadou Diouf, Fred Cooper, all of this began to tell different stories. Mamadou Diouf's work began to tell different stories and to showcase different aspects of how some of these kings and some of these aristocrats had to navigate complex forces and different pressures to make certain decisions. So people began to appreciate the nuances and the complexity of some of these choices. But prior to that, I think we didn't have room for these kinds of narrative, because the very field of African history arose out of that nationalist anti-colonial fervor of trying to produce national historiographical narratives that would boost the nationalist struggle. And this didn't fit into that. Aristocrats were not seen as, they were seen as conservative, they were seen as people who didn't buy into the nationalist project, who in some cases even opposed it, right? So those are the reasons, but that's pretty much it.
Can I just ask one real quick thing? So when they were fascinated about the traffic light, did they realize that that was invented by a black man, Garrett Morgan?
No. No. Because that was being showcased to them as one of the visual elements of British modernity.
Okay.
They were being dazzled, they were being shocked and all, and that's the way they perceived it. So the British were mediating that technology and that modernity for them. Does that make sense? The British colonizers, as they did most other things, they were mediating. They did not know, they had no idea. I don't see it in any of their writings, in any of their notes, their diaries, absolutely not. For them, this was London, and this was what made the white man great.
Yes.
Okay, so. All of you to enjoy lunch with us on the second room. Thank you. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.